Is Evelyn Schneider, and I will be clinically analyzing and diagnosing the character Lieutenant Dan Taylor from Forrest Gump. I will also be using DSM-5 criteria to evaluate and support the diagnosis, evidence, and treatments. Lieutenant Dan Taylor is a character in the film Forrest Gump. He serves as Forrest's platoon leader during the Vietnam War and is introduced as a driven military officer who values honor due to his family's long tradition of serving and dying in battle. Lieutenant Dan is eventually severely injured in a combat, and this results in the loss of both his legs. Following this event, his life begins to spiral into depression. The film takes place in 1960s and 1970s America, with a large part of the timeline centered around the Vietnam War. Lieutenant Dan serves in the U.S. Army and is deployed to Vietnam, where he experiences direct combat when his platoon is targeted by enemy fire. This context will be important to consider when determining his diagnosis. Lieutenant Dan Taylor most likely suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder as a result from combat trauma and the loss of his legs. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a result of traumatic experiences and involves symptoms such as anger, anxiety, and distress. Major depressive disorder is a disorder characterized by negative mood, loss of purpose, and disinterest in activities. Considering cultural context, PTSD was not officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association in the 1970s. So if Lieutenant Dan went to a therapist, he would probably be diagnosed with depression only. I believe that PTSD is diagnosed in many cultures, but not in the same ways that it is diagnosed in Western culture. Some cultures may not consider PTSD a serious condition or may not recognize it at all. Others may emphasize some symptoms over others or consider the disorder more physical than mental. In the U.S. culture, there is a strong stigma surrounding PTSD and major depressive disorder. Many veterans, especially during the Vietnam War, were discouraged from showing signs of mental illness and seeking treatments as it was viewed as a weakness. According to research done in 2004, many military members with PTSD did not seek mental health treatment due to stigma. One symptom that Lieutenant Dan repeatedly exhibits in the film is a persistent negative mood state. He constantly shows anger, resentment, guilt, and shame after being injured in Vietnam. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, these symptoms are consistent with the diagnosis of PTSD. One example of this is shown during an altercation between Lieutenant Dan and Forrest Gump, when Lieutenant Dan angrily yells at Forrest Gump for saving him instead of letting him die. I have also included a quote from this scene here. Another symptom that Lieutenant Dan exhibits is self-destructive behavior and a disregard for safety. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, this symptom is consistent with the diagnosis of PTSD. In the film, this symptom is shown through Lieutenant Dan's alcoholism following his injuries. According to research, 35 to 40% of individuals with PTSD also have a disorder related to alcoholism, as it is commonly used as a coping mechanism. Here's another quote from the film that demonstrates Lieutenant Dan's feelings of depression and loss of identity during his altercation with Forrest Gump. One symptom that is not shown in the film is dissociative reactions such as flashbacks. According to DSM-5, this symptom is typically prominent with a diagnosis of PTSD, despite Lieutenant Dan showing no signs of experiencing flashbacks of any kind. This may be due to the fact that a major part of Lieutenant Dan's PTSD is linked to his injuries, which have heavily affected his mental state after his military service rather than during. Some potential treatment plans that Lieutenant Dan could benefit from include cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, counseling, medication, such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, and veteran support groups. CBT could be particularly helpful in reducing stress and developing healthier strategies for processing trauma. Medication, similarly, could reduce anxiety and depression symptoms, while counseling or veteran support groups could provide support, a sense of community, and opportunities to process traumatic experiences. Even if treatment is available, there are still ethical considerations that may obstruct the recovery process. For example, CBT counseling and veteran support groups may temporarily increase distress and anxiety by continuously exposing patients to sensitive topics. The right to refuse therapy is also an important consideration. Even if PTSD patients benefit from therapy, they are not required to attend treatment sessions or take medication. This could be detrimental considering that PTSD patients are often inclined to avoid triggering situations, even if those situations include treatment. A societal barrier that would also hinder positive progress is stigma. Stigma surrounding mental disorders and treatments often discourage veterans from admitting struggles and seeking help. In the film, Lieutenant Dan accurately portrays post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder. The portrayal of disorders in film oversimplifies or even at times exaggerates mental illness and deeply impacts how people view those who suffer from PTSD and depression. While the media can raise awareness, most of the time the portrayal of these disorders are inaccurate. If the struggle was portrayed in a different context, we might consider those with PTSD or depression as weak or cowardly, as some military stigma emphasizes. Other contexts may portray these struggles as more of a physical disorder, while others may not recognize the disorders at all. Finally, here is a list of my references, including several empirical research articles.